and we are live.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Michel Beaudouin-Lafon. I'm the moderator today for this Hot Topics program from the ACM on artificial intelligence, real regulation, international perspectives and prospects. So we have a great panel, but before I introduce them and we start the discussion, let me introduce you to the rules of the game. So the panel today is recorded. It is also live captioned, and all your microphones are muted. The way to communicate with the panelists and the panel is primarily through the Q&A button. So you can send chat messages, which will be read by the panel members and by myself, the moderator. But really, it's better to use the Q&A button so you can so we can see the questions you have. And when we get to the question part of the webinar, we can easily see them and sort them out. And again, you won't get to ask your questions yourself. The moderator, myself, will pick the questions, and you can give your name or have anonymous questions as you wish. If you have a problem with technical aspects, you can send a chat message to ACM Policy, and behind that name is Adam Exgrove, who's organizing the seminar here and the director of policy at ACM. So a few words about the ACM Technology Policy Council. Well, you can know all about it going to this website, acm.org/public policy. And you can also email at acmpo@acm.org. That goes directly to Adam. So the ACM Technology Policy Council is a global policy council, as representatives from various areas around the world. It also encompasses two geographical committees, the US Technology Policy Committee, which has a long history in that area from ACM from, I think, like 30 years ago. And more recently, the Europe Technology Policy Committee that was created a few years ago with the ACM Europe Council. We have publications called Tech Briefs, which is targeting policy makers. And so the mission of the ACM Technology Policy Council, TPC, is to inform the computing community and general public about impact of computing in general. To provide independent, nonpartisan, and technology-neutral research and resources to policy leaders and other stakeholders. To leverage this broad base to identify scientific research and best practices relevant to public policy, and to deliver science-based analysis to help policy leaders understand the impact of technology. Among the products of the council, we have tech briefs, we'll get to this in a minute, but also statements developed typically by either the US or the Europe Technology Policy Committee. So a number of them recently have been on AI. Here's the list for the past year of those that are directly related to the topic of today on artificial intelligence. I want to bring your attention to the second one, generative artificial intelligence, generative AI. This is what the tech brief looks like. And so we had three recently that were about AI. So it's a 4-pager where the front page has main policy implications, a few statistics. Then there's 2 pages of in-depth content about the topic. And the last page is about all the references and notes about the sources for this document. I encourage you to go to the website there, acm.org Public Policy Tech Briefs, where you can access them. Now, the ICM has other publications, of course, about policy, but I wanted to focus on this one here. So now to get started with the panel itself. So as I said, my name is Michel Beaudouin-Lafon. I'm a professor of computer science at Université Paris-Saclay near Paris. I'm currently the ACM Technology Policy Council Vice Chair. And we have 3 top-notch panelists, Dame Wendy Hall, ACM past president. I won't read all her titles, many responsibilities at the University of Southampton, but also a member of the Global Commission on Internet Governance and former chair of the Ada Lovelace Institute. So welcome, Wendy. We have Juha Heikkila, advisor for artificial intelligence in the European Commission, Directorate General for Communications, Network, Content and Technology, developer of the EU AI strategy, previously head of European Commission unit that was instrumental in developing the 2018 AI strategy coordinated plan and other activities related to AI at the European Commission. So welcome, Juha. And finally, Marc Rotenberg, who's a member of the US Technology Policy Committee, but also executive director and founder of the Center for AI and Digital Policy. He's also a member of the OECD AI group of experts and has been very active in the area of policy, informing policy around the world. So you can find more about the three panelists on the website for the panel of today. But I think what we all want to do is to get into the matter of today, which is discussing artificial intelligence and the state and prospects for governance of AI around the world. So the way we're going to do this, I'm going to start by giving each panelist 2 to 3 minutes for a short introductory statement. Then I will go again around the three of them to ask them what is the state of AI regulation in their geographic area. And then we'll have a series of questions and discussion for until about the top of the hour. And we'll keep the last half hour for answering your questions. And so again, I really invite you to put your questions in the Q&A panel of the system here. So for introductory statements, I will start with Marc.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michel and Adam, for organizing the panel. And Juha and Wendy, it is great to see you. We are in a very good moment for discussion about AI policy. There is a lot happening around the world, I would say, particularly recently in the United States. And I'm going to make just a few opening remarks about what I see happening and some of the upcoming challenges. I want to begin by saying, as a way of introduction, at the Center for AI and Digital Policy, we've actually built a big program to train future AI policy leaders in AI governance. We study the emerging frameworks for the governance of AI, which include the OECD AI principles that were adopted by the G20, the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics, the AI Act of the European Union, which is currently approaching the finish line, as well as the AI Treaty at the Council of Europe, and all the recent developments underway in the United States and elsewhere. We also publish an annual report called AI and Democratic Values, which is a comparative study of countries' AI policies and practices. We have a methodology to rate and rank country AI practices. We're about to issue our fourth edition in spring of 2024. Upcoming, of course, is also the UK AI Summit, which I'm sure Wendy will tell us a bit about. What is most remarkable to me about this moment is the fact that governance frameworks have, in fact, been put in place. And there seems to be key agreements on certain essential pillars. For example, to say that AI systems should be trustworthy and human-centric is not controversial, or to say that AI systems should ensure fairness, accountability, and transparency is also not controversial. Ethical principles and national AI strategies all reflect these goals. And if you see the evolution of AI policies and practices, you'll also note, for example, in the UNESCO recommendation, issues related to sustainability and gender equity, which also seem to me not controversial. The provocative point I'm going to make now and then stop is to ask the question, why is it that in this moment, when there's so much focus on the most recent cycle of AI innovation, which is, of course, generative AI, are people putting aside these pre-existing policy frameworks where there is already consensus about the management of AI systems? That's where I think our attention needs to be.
Okay, thank you, Marc. So Juha, your turn for a few remarks.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here and represent the European Commission and the European Union in such great and esteemed company with Wendy and Marc. So let me maybe start by, in a way, stating the obvious. You all know that the European Union is planning to regulate AI. As Marc already pointed out, we are on the final straight on finalizing the AI Act. And when we started doing that, when we published our proposal 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, actually now, we had, it was a lonely place, if you like. So no one else particularly was keen on that. We got a lot of criticism for that. Some people called us courageous or worse. And it was felt to be something quite bold, and from some quarters it was considered to be also to be necessary. We, however, did feel that it was needed, and why we thought it was needed was simply because we felt that there has to be a certain level of trust that we can ensure, because we know that for AI, which can be a very powerful and useful technology, which brings lots of benefits, but for those benefits to materialize, we need to have uptake. And for the uptake to materialize, we need to have trust in this technology. So this was from us a measure to ensure that we have AI in the European Union, which can be used safely and with confidence. And this was the kind of rationale behind it from that perspective. So we wanted to craft this what we sometimes call the third way, though, you know, the numbers are getting smaller. And we felt that this was a reason for us to act and take the lead and see then if others follow, because we needed to do it from our needs and from our perspectives. But, you know, this we combined from the beginning, and we still combine it with also a package of measures which address innovation in AI. I want to add this and highlight this, although this is not our topic today as such, but I want to mention it simply because many people think that the only thing we do is regulation in the EU, and that is not at all the case. We have quite significant measures in place to support research and innovation in AI, and we want to also support the deployment and uptake. And we have different programs to do that, and we have also increased our funding very significantly in this regard. And then a third element, which is part of our strategy, is also then the international engagement, which is obviously a key to this session. So we have stated already a while ago, that a long time ago, in fact, that we want to build coalitions internationally. We want to work with those who advocate the responsible governance of AI, with those who want to set guardrails on AI, and we want to be part of that coalition, and we want to be an active part in driving those coalitions where we see that we can have the momentum behind us and to foster and promote the good governance and responsible stewardship of AI. So that means then that we are involved in a number of international forums which deal with this. So G7, the Global Partnership on AI, UNESCO, and the OECD, to name some. And of course, we're also working bilaterally with our partner countries to advocate these same topics and to advocate these same goals. So this is, in a nutshell, how we want to deal with things. And of course, now these two aspects, the governance aspect and the international aspect, that is coming together in the developments that we've seen now recently, as Marc explained, and the governance initiatives are getting more and more numerous. So of course, now that's, as he said, a very exciting time to be in this space. So I'll stop there by way of an introduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juha. So, Wendy.
Hi, good to be with you. Thanks for inviting me. Great to be with old friends, and it is a very timely, and new friends, and it is a very timely time to talk about this topic. So let me just dive in. I've worked with AI. I did my first AI project in 1984. My MSc thesis was about an intelligent tutoring system written in Prolog. I'm not sure I've ever told you that before, Michel. Like, it seems it's 40 years ago next year. Intelligent tutoring systems in 1984 was a bit of a toy thing to talk about, because how could you possibly build them? But we were thinking about them then. So there are people, of course, a lot of people in the world who think AI started in November 2022 with ChatGPT. And I was talking to people just to set the framing for this is an ACM webinar, so I'm assuming most people will be technically focused, or at least savvy. But a lot of people I talk to, particularly in the media, I do an awful lot of media these days. But there's something about AI in the headlines every day, and I'm always getting the phone calls. Can you explain it? Is it going to kill us in 2 years' time? Right? Am I going to die of AI? My kids are frightened. All these sorts of things, and they mean the ChatGPT stuff. And there are people that think, if it isn't intelligent, whatever that means, then it's not AI. And you have to sort of tell them, well, actually, the things you use on here, the face recognition, everything, it's around us all the time. And we, the community, have always called this stuff AI, but the meaning of that term, those two words, have changed quite substantially in the last, since the 50s, since 56 when it was coined. And we take that for granted. And it occurred to me last week that actually we shouldn't take that. We have to explain why we call it all artificial intelligence when most of it is not intelligent at all. And then people say, well, it has to learn to be intelligent. And, some of us will think of systems that don't do any learning, but we think of them as AI. So, I think we have to be careful as a community that we are explaining it well. Anyway, for my sins, the reason why I've suddenly, because I'm most well known for what I've done with the web and the internet, but for my sins, I was asked to co-chair the UK's AI review in 2017, which was about the time that the Commission was starting its work on the AI Act. And this was when people really started to think this stuff was going to get serious, and we were going to have to think about regulation. And I'll come back to how the UK's approached that in a minute, and we'll get more time on that anyway. So the review was published in 2017. There were 20 recommendations. The UK government picked them up and developed a strategy out of that. And we had the Office for AI and the AI Council, which I was a member, and the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, blah, 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 blah. Now, this was going along, right? The EU was developing its AI Act. We were doing our thing, and we came out of the EU, but we're still interested in what the Act is and how we can apply it ourselves. And then last November, there was a pivot, right? ChatGPT came out and everything seemed to change. I can talk more about this later, but we really have now got a focus, and the summit next in 2 weeks' time, which is very behind closed doors. I have a ticket, but they're like gold dust. There's 100 seats on day one, and I've got one of them. I'm not quite sure why. There are hardly any academics there. It will be mainly government officials. I can talk more about this later. And the tech companies. And what's happened, and again, I can unpack this a bit more later, is that in the last year, the big tech companies, which all sit on the west coast of America or the south coast of China, have very much taken over the rhetoric in this space. And our governments have largely, in the US and UK, have been bedazzled by this. And we've gone this hype wave, this scaremongering, regulate us, right? The way we want to be regulated type of wave. I think that's probably all I need to say for my introduction. The UK, of course, did produce its white paper on AI regulation, which I can talk more about in March 23, but that was almost totally overshadowed by the fact that Elon Musk did his letter that said, we've got to stop for 6 months, everybody stop for 6 months, panic, 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 because I want to start a new company, says Elon Musk. Anyway, that's another whole rat hole we're going down here. And I'll just finish by saying two things. One, the geopolitics, if you want to know about the geopolitics of AI, read my book, Four Internets, because that's what we're going that way. In Europe, we don't have any of the big companies, so what we really can do is regulate, talk about regulation, but they'll all be regulated by what happens in the White House in Washington or in Beijing in China. So we need to think about that a bit. But also, I want to pick up on my final point is something that Mark said, which is, we all sign up to, yes, diversity, fairness, inequalities, but actually in practice, there is none of that. All right, so yes, we're all like, yeah, of course we all want this, but there is actually none of it around at the moment. I despair about diversity in AI, and I don't just mean gender diversity. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Wendy. I think what I'd like to do here, because probably in the audience, not everybody is aware of the exact state of AI policing around the world, or at least around the areas that are presented here. So, Juha, could you tell us in a short time and in practical terms what is in the AI Act, and what is what is in there that will have impact on companies, on people? So, what are the big things in the AI Act?
Okay, thanks. So very briefly, it's a risk-based approach. So it's a so-called horizontal piece of legislation. So it will apply to AI in different sectors. It's based on risk. So the measures that are provided for in the future regulation will apply based on risk. So in those cases where the use of AI in certain defined cases considered to be high risk, there are certain requirements in the future regulation which will then have to be fulfilled, and the providers of AI systems will have to show this by ex-ante conformity assessment. There are a small number of banned uses of AI which we think are so harmful and not compatible with our values that they are proposed to be banned. So, for example, subliminal manipulation leading to harm or general purpose social scoring. Then the core is these high-risk areas, which are basically AI used in a safety component in already regulated products like machinery or medical devices. And then a number of use cases, areas like, for example, the operation of critical infrastructure, justice, and areas related to border control and asylum matters. So there are 8 of those. Of course, these are under discussion. They have not been finalized because the act has not been finalized. But that's the essence of it, the risk-based notion. And as I said, it's a regulation that applies equally in all the member states of the European Union. So this way we wanted to avoid fragmentation, because we wanted to have the same conditions for deployment of AI in the different member states. And also we wanted to avoid the fragmentation of the single market. So despite the fact that the European Union is a union of 27 member states, we have a single market, and we wanted to avoid the fragmentation of the market and the fragmentation of the legal landscape. So that's the essence of it. And basically, after it was put forward by the European Commission, it's now being discussed by the co-legislators, which in this case are the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. The Council represents the member states. So they are the co-legislators which will have to adopt this act, and they are currently finalizing, they are discussing and reconciling their differences, because each of them put forward their own position on the AI Act. These are not different development stages, but they are the positions of the different institutions. And now the discussions between the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission are ongoing leading up to the adoption, which we hope will take place at the end of this year or early next year. So that's in a nutshell where we are.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So now let's cross the pond and go to the US. So Marc, what's the story there?
Well, the story is that there is a lot happening. I wrote a column recently for CACM titled "Everything, Everywhere, All at Once," which was my assessment of the development of AI policy in the United States really just in the last year. We have Senator Schumer leading issues forums to educate the U.S. Senate about AI. We have many congressional committees holding hearings with experts, exploring legislation. We have federal agencies calling for public comment on AI regulation for employment and for health and for other sectors. We have a notable legislative proposal from Senator Blumenthal and Senator Hawley, who we would say may not agree on much else, but appear to agree on the need for comprehensive legislation for the governance of AI. And it's actually titled the U.S. AI Act. We're looking forward to introduction and consideration in the Senate later this year. But I would say probably most remarkable and perhaps to some most surprising about the United States is the degree of leadership at the White House, and particularly by President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, who have over the last 6 months clearly made AI a national priority. They've brought to the White House the tech CEOs, but they've also brought to the White House civil society groups, labor leaders, academic experts, and others for consultation. President Biden has said very directly that companies should not release AI systems that are not safe. That is a strong foundational position. And he has extracted commitments from many of the tech CEOs to abide by a set of principles. So there's a lot happening from our perspective. It's moving in a positive direction. I can't say for certain if we will have legislation over the next 6 months, but I know a lot more is to come, including an executive order from the White House, which could come in just the next few weeks.
Okay, great. And so, Wendy, what's the situation in the UK? What do you think is going to happen in this AI summit?
Well, I wish I knew. So let me just say, first of all, the UK's position is, well, first of all, when the AI Act started, we were in the EU, so we actually contributed to discussions. So, you know, I'm very grateful to the EU for doing all the heavy lifting on that. But the UK's position was set out in the white paper in March 23, which is not to go to mandatory law, but to use existing agencies to and existing laws, if you like, to manage the regulation of AI initially. And it was designed to be an innovation approach and a sector, you know, different for different sectors approach. So a different approach, but the aims and objectives are similar. And of course, we've been working on our online safety bill. I have a lot I could say about that, but because the whole issue of who can manage content is so, when you want to protect free speech as well as privacy, this dichotomy lives throughout this debate: free speech, privacy. And so that's been one of the things our government's been working on a lot. But this whole thing, as Marc said, there's been a lot happening since all these things, our white paper, the EU AI Act, were all developed. And I understand you are going to say, oh, yes, we take account of generative AI because of our approach. Yes, but they were all both developed before the ChatGPT moment. And that has given this, and I don't know what it's like in the EU and what the EC's permission, not the EU, the EC's position is on this. But the White House and 10 Downing Street have definitely pivoted towards being influenced a lot by the big tech companies, and the CEOs of those companies have, as you say, gone to the White House, come to number 10. Yes, they're beginning to bring in out in the UK, thinking again about the academics and bringing in the civil liberties groups to the discussions, but it's marginal at the moment. There's been such a pivot. They disbanded the AI Council, for example. They've disbanded the advisory board for the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which I think are all backward steps. And the summit next week, no, the week after. Sorry, I'm on a cruise next week. I keep thinking my next work week, I go into the summit. I have the agenda. That's all I have. I have no idea who else is there. And I'm only going to day one. Day two is when the world leaders will go. I don't know who's actually going to turn up. I know it's not Biden, it's Harris. I don't know if the president of the EC is going. I don't know if Macron and the German leader are going. I mean, until they turn up, we don't know. It's more like a G20 meeting than anything else. But the day one of the summit, every agenda item is about the risks associated with what they're calling frontier models. Now, that was a term which came out of the Frontier Foundation, which was in July. It's all happening so fast, which, as I understand it, Mark might know better. The Frontier Foundation is the coming together of the tech companies, I believe. It's their discussion forum. They've come up with this term, frontier model, which I think is meant to say this stuff, we're developing this, it's such powerful stuff. I mean, think what GPT-6 is going to be like. It's going to be so dangerous. You know, it's a lot of spin and marketing and frightening stuff to people who don't understand that these things are just predictive processing. But anyway, there's this frontier model. It's like we're all suddenly pioneers at developing something that's going to kill the human race. The rhetoric doesn't make any sense, which is why people get confused. And I want to say one other thing, which we haven't even yet worked out how to regulate something as what I would perceive now to be quite straightforward, like facial recognition. Yeah, I don't know what it's like. Maybe Juha might in the EC, you might know how to do that. In the UK, we haven't thought about how to regulate facial recognition, and yet our police and our secret intelligence agencies beginning to use it. The shops are beginning to use it to defeat shoplifting, but we haven't actually worked out globally what the position is on facial recognition. And that's much more straightforward than generative AI. And this leads me to my final point, which is the UN, the United Nations, has declared, and the announcement will be next week, an AI advisory board, and we all need to feed our ideas into that, because that sort of board at that level can think about what we need, what sort of organization we need globally to bring all this together at the principles level, so it can then be mapped down into national regulation that meets with local cultural and legal regulations. So don't forget that that's about to emerge.
Thank you. And so, I mean, what we've heard is that all of these approaches are driven by the notion that, you know, some uses of AI are risky and can endanger human lives or cause other harm. So there's one side of the question is how do you determine, you know, what is risky and how risky it is. But the part I would like to ask you about is, assuming this is done, how do you then audit or certify a system to be, you know, compliant with whatever regulation there is? Do we need to have, like we do for, you know, the FDA for drugs in the US or the equivalent in Europe, where an independent organization is in charge of certifying these AI products? Is that the right approach? Is that even possible? And there's also the question of who is responsible in case things go wrong. And so, but on this issue of what is the right way to implement auditing and certification, who wants to take that one on?
I don't mind starting.
Go ahead.
I've thought about this a lot, and I think I'm always I think I'm always an optimist. I think we can, and I think you're right, Michel, to draw attention to how we do it in finance, AI, and we have to bring data into this. I mean, also the other thing the governments I think have got wrong is they tend to put data and AI in different buckets. And at the moment, you can't train an AI system without data. So you have to and also the way it's trained. I mean, there are at least 3 layers you have to think about with something like a generative AI system. But I think we should think about the ways in which you can. It's all about its transparency, and I know the EU AI law talks about that. Act talks about that a lot. Transparency, but how do you evaluate, test something? And that's going to, some systems you can think about how you're going to evaluate and test them. Other systems, like there was a headline the other day, Google's developing an AI counselor or therapist. how do you evaluate and test something like that, right? Which could be so helpful, but also so incredibly dangerous. And how do you actually regulate that sort of system? And then there's the whole idea of auditing. And I like the word auditing. Some people don't. I think it because it says, I think, what we're trying to do, which is companies will probably initially self-audit, and then the government will work out ways in which they bring in, will have a legal authority that will mandate auditing and then bring in audits, not maybe every year like you have to in finance, but enough so that you can test what they're claiming they're doing. And so I think we can, but we can't. We don't know how to do it yet. We have to learn how to do it. And B, I don't think we should rush into it, because there's new stuff coming down the pipe all the time. New stuff that anything we set up has got to be able to deal with the stuff we don't know about yet in the future.
Yeah.
Just as in finance. And I'll finish with one other thing. What was I going to say? Yeah, I have a big issue about open source. And I'd love people in the community to pile in on this, because, everybody says, oh, we want to produce open source models so that we can encourage innovation. Well, who's regulating those? I mean, I think the AI, and correct me if I'm wrong, the EU AI Act talks about the application rather than the people developing the core product, or is it both? Because if you're giving away open source models, and what in generative AI systems and open source it means, who's regulating that world? And again, it comes back to the spectrum of innovation versus regulation. There's a spectrum that we've got to sort of navigate.
So, Mark, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So I think a key concept to answer your question, Michel, is the need for impact assessments. And if you look at the various governance frameworks, including the EU AI Act and the UNESCO recommendation, the European Law Institute, by the way, everyone talks about the need for impact assessments. And these impact assessments all have certain essential qualities. One quality is that they need to be independent of the company that's undertaking to deploy a system. And we know this from the world of finance when we think about auditing. We routinely go to people outside the company to verify a company's finances, and it's perfectly appropriate, I would say, to expect that as well to conduct auditing of AI systems. The second key attribute of an impact assessment is that it has to be done prior to deployment. And we know this as well because if we don't assess before deployment, we will potentially, create situations of risk and even catastrophe that could have been avoided. But the corollary, and now we're on to the third principle for impact assessments, is that we have to be prepared to say in some instances, if the risk is greater than the benefit, the system should not be deployed. And to Wendy's earlier point, increasingly, many governments have actually reached that conclusion about facial surveillance technology and the use of the product developed by Clearview, which is essentially, mass surveillance on the public, oftentimes used without any judicial authority. It's an AI deployment that, with an impact assessment, would lead to the conclusion that this is a system that should not be put in place. And I think if we think through the logic, again, to Wendy's point, we can actually handle emerging technologies, because part of what an impact assessment requires you to do is anticipate as best you can in the moment what the consequence will be, if you put in place a system. Now, I've just outlined what to me appear to be the three straightforward characteristics of impact assessments that are already in place in many of the governance frameworks for AI. But as I said at the outset, what's a bit of concern is that the companies that are calling for regulation are also ignoring all of this history and all of these well-understood standards. I mean, if you want good regulation for AI, as the tech CEOs claim, let's mandate impact assessments, let's make them independent, let's conduct them prior to deployment, and let's agree on prohibitions where necessary. To me, this is just very straightforward.
Yeah, I just said you're so right, Mark, but it's not so straightforward in
Because
implementing
it's too sensible, right? Was that my mistake? Being a little too sensible today?
And so what's your answer to also people who worry that this is all regulation stuff and will stifle innovation, will make it harder for small startup to be able to comply to whatever impact assessment or other ways of certifying and auditing systems will happen. So are we worried about that? Are we worried that we may regulate too much and other parts of the world maybe will then have a competitive advantage and beat us?
Yeah, I don't have, I'm just going to say, I don't have that concern. We had a very interesting discussion recently in our research group at the Center for AI and Digital Policy. And I asked this question. I said, some people are saying that licensing is going to favor big tech and create obstacles to innovation. I said, I'm genuinely confused by that argument because we have licenses for everything. We have licenses for driving cars, for cutting hair, for fishing. I mean, we are so used to in our society trying to establish, basic levels of competency before people hold them out for examples as experts, that the idea that somehow we would put aside this rapidly evolving realm where so much risk has already been identified and so many concerns to public safety described, people say, but for this, we don't want licensing. I mean, it's entirely sort of ahistoric when viewed in context. I don't see the problem with license.
Thank you. So you had one to comment?
If I may comment on the innovation regulation kind of dichotomy, I think the antagonism is misplaced in some respects. I think many people kind of present that argument, but I know many people who also work on the innovation side who would agree that it's too simplistic to present in this way. I think the one thing that we should consider is the fact that regulation provides legal certainty. We firmly believe that regulation can actually foster innovation, support innovation. So that legal certainty argument, according to companies that I've heard speaking about this, they consider that quite important. It's not my area, and I don't want to go into it in any detail, but another piece of EU legislation, the General Data Protection Regulation, it was commented on by a major tech company at some point to me privately that, they may not like all the aspects that are there, but at least they have, they know what the operating environment is, they know what the rules of the game are, and they know then how to act accordingly. So this legal certainty seems to be a factor which is quite important to companies. I remember at an event just after the release of the AI Act, someone said, what are we going to do now? We have all this uncertainty about regulation in the EU for the next couple of years or so. And I said, well, at least you know that something is coming and the outlines are well known. From the other jurisdictions, you don't know anything yet. So I think that's even more uncertainty. So in that regard, the rules will become clear. I mean, of course, there are many aspects that are still open, and some of the things that we raised today I cannot comment on simply because it's subject to the final agreement between the three institutions that are finalizing the AI Act. So that applies, for example, generative AI and some of the other things. But within a few months, we will have the final version of that will be adopted, and then we know exactly where we are with that. Let me just add one thing, which is related to the changing landscape, changing technology rather, which is that the AI Act was conceived in such a way that the high-risk areas and the banned uses of AI, that they can be actually revised and the acts can be amended more easily, more quickly than the original. So we're not going to be needing like 2.5, 3 years to finalize amendments to it. It can be done in a more quickly procedure.
Juha, is there anything you can say? Oh, sorry. I just want to ask you about open source. Can you say anything about how the Act's going to deal with open source?
No, at this stage I cannot, because that's also one of the issues that is under discussion.
It's all about who's responsible, right?
Yeah,
When
yeah.
things go wrong and at what level it's going wrong. What yeah.
Well, this is a very interesting discussion. There's a couple of other topics I'd like to cover, and I see time is running. Well, we've heard already the term generative AI mentioned several times. There's a whole host of topics around that. One I would like to ask, maybe ask Marc first about this, is this issue that the data sets used to train these large language models or large anything models come from publicly available data, but is often copyrighted and so infringing on the rights of authors. And there's also the other side of the issue of who owns the output of a generative AI. So I know, Marc, you're involved in the case at the FTC with OpenAI around these issues. You want to address this?
Sure. Well, actually, two different answers. I mean, the question you're asking about copyright and generative AI is particularly timely right now in the United States, because there have been a number of copyright cases brought against OpenAI and Google and others. And the concern, of course, is that the works that may be publicly accessible, but that doesn't mean out of copyright or not subject to legal protection, have been incorporated in these big models. And the companies that have acquired this information produced by others are obtaining the commercial benefit. So if you are a copyright holder, it would be not surprising at all for you to claim, an infringement and a loss of the work that you've done. And we're seeing those cases move forward. There's in the moment a looming possible lawsuit between OpenAI and the New York Times, because the New York Times archive is a wonderful resource for people who are trying to model the English language, which of course the New York Times knows and is not prepared to give that to OpenAI. But here's the second key point in the discussion. So you have not only the infringement, which is a familiar problem to copyright lawyers and policymakers, but now you also have the ability to replicate the work of the original author and displace the original author. And this can happen across many sectors. It can happen in art, in music, in movies, and elsewhere, where it's not just that you are now duplicating someone else's work, you're taking their identity, their style, and everything else, and essentially replacing them. And I do see that as an existential issue for the creators. We talk, in various contexts about existential risk. But if you're a creator and there's a company that's selling a service that essentially reflects your creative spirit, you have a real concern. I could come back in a moment if there's time and talk separately about our complaint regarding OpenAI, the Federal Trade Commission, but you just asked such a good question about copyright. I wanted to take a few minutes on that.
Any other comment on that? I may add another question around these issues is, should it be required to label the content produced by or with the help of generative AI? Is that practical? Is that something that's been considered in any of the
it's more about
agendas?
is it policeable? Yeah, I mean that's the problem. With my ACM Publications Board hat on, we're looking at things. You can now generative AI can write a research paper. We can argue about quality, but language will be probably very good. It can review papers, and we're having to write policies about making sure, so you have to say if you're using AI, you can use ChatGPT to help you do your research or to sharpen your language, but it can't. ChatGPT or one of the others, any of the others can't be an author. And you can use it to help you write your reviews, but you've actually got to put the thought into it. But policing that is going to be so difficult, so very difficult, especially we talk about deep fakes in the sort of the world, the world out there, as everyone knows, but in scholarly publishing, people are starting to produce deep fakes of their own papers and then putting, I don't know if you call it a deep fake, but they're starting to produce endless copies of their own paper, sending them all to the same conference. So they all get reviewed, and then, you know, one of them might get reviewed well. And so they're into the conference. And it's so hard to spot this.
I wanted to
But
say one more word, if I could. I agree with Wendy, by the way. It's quite remarkable to follow the various guidelines that scientific publications and universities and others are trying to put in place for generative AI. But there was also a very interesting decision from a US federal court earlier this year that I just will say a couple of words about. And the case concerned the issue in part as to whether work produced with the aid of generative AI could be subject to copyright. And in the moment, you know, the court said no, although eventually I think the courts will say generative AI, like photography, is simply a technique and can be incorporated into the creativity of the human author. But the more interesting conclusion in the court's opinion was as to whether the authorship could be ascribed to the generative AI program that created the work, you see. And here the court said no, that authorship is something that we assign to individuals and not to devices. And I saw this as a very important opinion. Now, there's some people, by the way, you know, with interesting business models that were not too happy. And they said, well, we actually have a way to create programs that will become very good authors. And the value of these systems will be in part the fact that these authors can create works that will then have legal claims over their creations. So you can imagine where this could go. But the reason I felt so strongly this was a good outcome is if you give systems authorship, then they will also have the right to bring legal cases against people when the work of the system has been infringed. You're following me? Yes?
Yes.
I don't think we want to be in that world. So this particular opinion by Judge Howell here in Washington, D.C., I think was a victory for humans as authors over machines.
So if I may,
go ahead, please.
Quickly comment on that and the previous points. So I'm not a lawyer, so I could be way off here, but this kind of reminds me a bit of the discussion about whether for example, robots should be given legal personality. And I think that for reasons that you mentioned, Mark, and also others, you know, I think that could be. That is something that I've noticed many experts working in the field have soundly rejected because they feel that it's basically opening up a Pandora's box, because ultimately humans have to be responsible, and you can always just wash your hands off by saying it wasn't me doing that, it was the AI or the robot doing it. So I don't have any kind of liability, any responsibility for that. Just on watermarking or authentication, I understand this is something that a lot of people seem to consider to be a very important aspect if it can be implemented. There are technical issues related to it as far as I've understood, so it works better for audio and visual content, whereas for text apparently it does not work so well, at least currently. Of course, we don't know where we are further down the line, but there are, it seems, technical limitations, but also the desire to have this is quite understandable.
Thank you. Yeah. Given the time, I'd like to shift to the next topic I had planned here, which is the impact of AI on jobs. And again, there are many sides to this. We hear predictions that are, you know, radically contradictory. Some say, well, kill millions of jobs. Others say will create better jobs. The reality now, I think, is AI is creating a lot of poorly paid jobs of people who have to feed all these models. But is there a role for policymaking in trying to address this issue of shifts in jobs? And we've seen, for example, in the recent or still ongoing strike, as far as I know, of actors in the US, you know, the fear of being replaced by by AI generated avatars or whatever. So is that something, well, the markets will sort it out, or is it something where policy should intervene?
Well, I'm not a labor economist, but I do know that many of the leading labor economists have said if you look at history, you go through technological changes and one set of jobs is displaced and replaced by a new and better set of jobs, and people become more productive, and this is progress. And there's certainly a lot of evidence to support that view. But at the same time, as people look at the current transformation, one of the key observations has been how remarkably quickly this is taking place. And you see labor retraining and the creation of new skills is a process that takes time. If you can reproduce, in a 2-year period, fine musical works or fine photographic works, without the need for hundreds of thousands of people who might otherwise be producing those works, you suddenly have a large number of people who are displaced. So my view of this issue is that there is, let's say, a hopeful scenario suggested by history, but a concern in the moment that the rate of change may not, in fact, allow for the creation of new jobs as quickly as may be necessary. I'm a big fan, by the way, just a final point on this. I'd like to see many, many more jobs in the AI auditing field, because if you took my point earlier on impact assessments, which I think should be a booming business in this moment, then I hope a lot of people will go into the field of AI auditing.
So I would like to sort of add to my question in the way AI is transforming jobs, because we tend to see it as, well, it's going to kill some jobs and create new jobs, better ones or not, we'll see. But I think they're transforming jobs. If you think of a doctor, for example, we have access to an AI system making diagnosis. My area of research is in human computer interaction. And so we see that, the same AI system, depending on how it is interfaced with the human, will lead to very different results. We know from various studies that if the AI gives the prediction or the recommendation, the human tends to follow it. And that creates de-skilling, because you let the AI do it, right? And when you need your expertise, it's not there anymore. Same thing when you're driving a self-driving car, the car will tell you one day, hey, you have to save me from this accident, but it will be too late because you've been de-skilled by not driving. And so I think this is an issue where we'll, in fact, use that argument to make humans responsible because they are in the loop, but at the same time, we put them in a situation where they cannot maintain nor develop their expertise. So is that something that worries you?
Well, I think there's a lot of work for your HCI people in this, because I think that we'll see AI will become part of the team that's doing the work. So in a medical situation, if you've got a team doing, talking about a case, well, there'll be an AI there. And the issue for me is, we'll of course anthropomorphize it, but how are we going to interact with it? And it will feel part of the team. Maybe it needs there's a whole issue about, does it need an employment contract? And these sorts of things will emerge. And the extreme example is what many of the science fiction writers have talked about, where we become cyborgs. We have AI in ourselves as well as machines, and you're already seeing chips in brains. Musk, for heaven's sake, is doing Neuralink, and we've got amazing examples of where the chip can read a brainwave, and that is going to grow and grow and grow. And so we'll have, we have to think about this whole issue of how human beings and intelligent machines work together, and set the regulator. We stay in control. I'm an optimist. In terms of jobs, my father was an accountant, did everything by hand. He divided pounds, shillings and pence by pounds, shillings and pence until the day he retired by hand. None of the jobs he did, the ledgers, everything, have all gone. But we have more jobs in the finance industry than you ever had before. But as Mark's point was, my father retired 40 years ago. And AI, and that's time as the new jobs have emerged. With AI, it's all happening so fast, and we can see the jobs, some of the jobs we want, but we haven't got time to train people and develop the degree program so that you can produce an AI auditor from a a business studies department or a finance department. So the speed of it is quite frightening, but that doesn't stop us. We must put in place the training and education to give people the skills for the future.
Michel,
yeah, please go ahead.
Just make a brief comment in response to your question about concern. I do actually have a background in computer programming, and many years ago, I was writing rule-based expert systems for chess and backgammon, which I understood, and if you produced an outcome and your program lost, you could adjust your evaluation algorithm, and maybe the knight needed to be in the center of the board or the king needed to be kept in the corner. And it was always possible, as I'm sure you recall, in that world, to assess your outputs and go back and make changes to optimize your system. And of course, now we're in a world of machine learning, which is a category of AI, but it produces these outcomes which, as impressive as they may be, are almost impossible to prove or replicate, right? And, we see these results, but if you try to answer the question, well, why did this move occur in this instance? And I'm recalling the famous match in 2018 between AlphaZero and Stockfish, you don't get an answer. And this is, what I'm worried about in our acceptance of AI-based decision-making, that we are being wowed by the systems, which are to be certain impressive, and that was the public's experience of encountering ChatGPT. But those most familiar with the technology are also most concerned because they see the lack of accountability in the domain, and that's something that really should be a wake-up call.
But what worries me is that we will create systems. I don't know if it's part of the AI Act, but I think it's the idea that the human is always to be responsible for whatever the AI system is doing in the end, which I think is a sensible thing to do. But I think we will create systems where we'll put a human in a situation where he or she is in the loop and will be made responsible if something bad happens, even though the cause of the problem may be system malfunction, and the fact that the user was not in a position, in fact, to control the system. And so I think there is some regulatory aspect here of, how do you decide who to blame, really, when things go wrong? We see that in airplane accidents, for example. Was it the pilot who made a mistake, or was the technology and the company that made the technology? Don't we have the same problem in the deployment of AI?
Well, the liability issue is a complex problem. I mean, there are traditional doctrines in law about assigning liability, but I can add on this point that the economists will tell you that you do want to assign liability on the party that's most likely in the future to diminish risk. And what that means in simple terms is you actually look to the original design, the manufacturer of the product or the service, to ensure public safety. That's the reason, for example, that if we get into a car accident, we don't go back to the car dealer who sold us the car and say, oh, the car you sold me had defective brakes. It's actually the manufacturer who's responsible for the creation of the car and the safety assessment of the brakes, which is also why when we talk about liability, I do think we need to keep focus on the so-called foundational models, or at least the sources of the LLMs. There may be downstream responsibility for how an LLM is deployed, but as to the data sets and the creation of the model, I don't see how you could ignore the responsibility of the source of the system.
Thank you. So we're at the top of the hour, a little bit past that. We have another 26 minutes. So I'd like to shift to a few questions that have come up in the Q&A. I want to thank the participants for asking many questions. So I'll start with one question by Rildian. Is there an international AI regulation and governance body? All capital letters. So I think we all know here on the panel, the answer is no. But is that something that may happen? Could there be international treaties? You know,
no, Michel. I think the best step forward is the UN declaring and a global advisory board. Not that the UN will be this body, but it's what type. Everyone's struggling to think about, are there examples of things out there that do climate change, nuclear warfare? You know, what examples of global bodies are there that do regulation? And there isn't one. It's exactly what we need for AI. But I do think the first step of the UN discussing this, and you know, even the global summit that the UK is running next week can discuss this, so that we can start to formulate the answer to that. There is not one at the moment,
No, indeed, there isn't one at the moment. Now, of course, there are initiatives underway which are trying to sort of fill the gap, if you like, in different ways by means of obviously voluntary commitments or voluntary obligations. So, for example, in G7, there is quite intensive work going on guardrails on generative AI and foundation models. So this is obviously then a relatively small group with the G7, with only those countries and the EU involved. And but that's kind of born out of this realization that we have to do something. This was launched by the G7 leaders in the spring, and the work has been quite intensively going on. It will result, they already published a ministerial statement. They're working towards guiding principles, which now there is a draft of that, and then towards a code of conduct on generative AI for providers of AI systems by the end of the year. Now, of course, there are other organizations which are interested in this, like the UN, as was pointed out by Wendy. And the UN, of course, consists of different parts, which have also, some of them have interest in AI separately, like the UNESCO and the ITU. Then, of course, there is the question to what extent it's feasible. I mean, I remember a comment by a colleague of mine that there is no such thing really as international law. So obviously, you know, the question is to what extent anything would be enforceable. And of course, if we take the broader the set of countries becomes, like the UN with 190 odd members, then the harder it becomes to agree on things, obviously, because not all of the members of the UN would necessarily see these things the same way, and they would not necessarily agree. The UNESCO did manage to actually agree on a recommendation, despite this disparity of countries. Nevertheless, when it gets even harder for some kind of an international watchdog, obviously, you know, when it gets more ambitious, it gets harder. That's what I wanted to say. So I think just the sheer fact that there is probably quite a lot of disagreement on what the mandate should be, what the kind of powers of such an organ should be, that makes the task, of course, quite challenging. But as I said, there are international initiatives underway which try to address some of these aspects.
Well,
can I just add?
Thank you.
Oh, let me just say something.
I was just going
Marc,
to,
and then Wendy.
I'm sorry, agreeing with Wendy and Juha, and at the same time, and this was my point at the outset, what is most remarkable is the level of consensus already obtained by among governments for the governance of AI. It is the OECD AI principles. It is the UNESCO recommendation on AI ethics that countries have already signed up for. Now, Wendy may be waving her arms because the hard work is enforcement, and there's no dispute on that. But I think two related points. One, so the IPCC is a good model, and actually in our recommendations to the UN, we said there should be an IPCC for AI. But the key point we made about the IPCC is it's scientific and informational and oriented toward reporting. It's not a governance model. That's not the aim of the IPCC, and we don't think that's what what should happen. But another phrase to keep in mind, as long as we're having the conversation, is there is certainly in the data protection realm with the GDPR, the concept of the Brussels effect. And it is quite possible that because the European Union has established a comprehensive framework for the governance of artificial intelligence, that companies in other countries wishing to participate in the European market will adopt those standards, and in effect, they become global standards. So this is a way that enforcement can be achieved without everyone's, sitting in a room and saying, we have 100% agreement.
Right. I must say this point.
Yeah.
Two things. Yes, we could, the European Union could become the world's police for AI. We'll see if that's what they want to do. But the elephant in the room is China. None of the things you've mentioned, Mark, or you include China. And I don't think you can have any sort of agreement when the second biggest, could be the biggest in time, AI developer technology and spreading tentacles all around the world, potentially half the world is influenced by Chinese technology, or more, if India went that same way, then you can't discuss this without having China at the table. And many of the things you've talked about, Mark, doesn't that GPA, UNESCO, OECD, they do not have China at the table.
So Wendy, to your point, and I agree with you, 2 quick points. One, on matters of public safety, I do think China should be at the table. As with the environment, you absolutely need to get the largest players in the room for agreement. But in the realm of protecting democratic values, which to us is important, I think the lesson that the US is learning is that if the US does not join with the EU and promote a favorable regulatory framework for the deployment of artificial intelligence, that space will be filled by China. So
I'm not arguing against that at all.
Yep.
I'm just saying you have to recognize that China needs to be at some of these tables. We should let Michel get the...
No, I mean, this is fascinating discussion, but there are so many topics that are brought up that I would like to cover a couple more. So there's one question from Camille Gobert, which I will summarize. When does a system becomes artificially intelligent? What is AI anyway? I mean, remember the definition of AI by the high-level European expert group was kind of vague. To me, it seems like, well, any algorithm is an AI. So in all this AI regulation, are we actually defining what it is we're talking about, or is it just any computer system? Because of course it will define whether all these rules apply to a system. If I can do the same thing as ChatGPT without it being an AI system, then all hell breaks loose.
Well, maybe I just can briefly comment on that. So obviously, for legislative purposes, you need to have a definition. So and any country, any jurisdiction planning to regulate AI, I mean, they will have to have it somewhere, somehow expressed, because that's what then the enforcement will be based on. And this is actually something that, I mean, there are some definitions there which have gained some currency. So the OECD has a definition of AI that is being revised, and that's quite close to what we have in the Act, which, by the way, may change from what it was initially proposed by the Commission. And of course, this is a balancing act, obviously, between covering enough but not covering too much. I mean, that's the problem with any definition of AI. It's not an easy task, but obviously you want to capture those systems which you want to capture, but you don't want to cover everything and anything. So that's not straightforward. Obviously, that is needed, and that there are good bases for that. And I think that for many purposes that we have, then we can find a satisfactory solution to that. I mean, I have to maybe remind those who are maybe not so familiar, there's much more to AI than just machine and deep learning based AI. And there's also the so-called good old-fashioned AI. Now with generative AI, that has even more receded to the background. Nobody talks about it. Whereas I remember a year and a half ago, until about a year and a half ago, there were lots of people, practitioners in the field, who felt that actually a hybrid system hybrid AI systems, which are based on both machine learning, deep learning techniques, and the conventional techniques, they would actually be the way forward to break some of the barriers where the systems fail.
Okay, thank you. Let me move to another question. A couple of questions actually, which I think are sort of in the same area. So the first one is by David Bowman. It seems we need to look at consumers and industry separately. Given the many new AI products that anyone can create, would consumer protection laws be the best place to regulate AI for consumers? And the other question by Carl Landwehr. There are movements afoot both in the US and the EU to establish liability for software products. Can you comment on the role of liability in AI regulation? To me, these are sort of in the same space of I guess, building on the existing type of regulation. Any comments?
I'll briefly answer the first question. It's an opportunity also to mention the complaint we brought to the Federal Trade Commission regarding OpenAI. We do think there are significant consumer protection issues with generative AI. If you read the system card, in fact, for OpenAI, the company itself identifies many risks to public safety, including misinformation and cybersecurity and political influence campaigns. And so we went to the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, which is the lead consumer protection agency, and we said simply, please open an investigation and make an assessment. Are there adequate consumer protections in this product, which is now a commercial product because people are paying to use it? We had good news this summer. Actually, the New York Times reported that the investigation we requested had been opened. But of course, we're waiting to see what the outcome will be. So I think the FTC in this moment is actually in a very good place to establish necessary safeguards from the consumer perspective for generative AI.
Okay. Other comments, anyone? So I'm looking at so we talked about transparency and explainability, and we all know this is tricky to achieve. So I'm asking the question, I don't see the author, I'm sorry. Does the panel have any thoughts on policy frameworks that need to be established to address transparency and explainability? And the question is also mentioning the AI Bill of Rights that the Biden administration has put forth.
Right. So again, briefly, both of those terms occur frequently in governance frameworks. You'll see transparency and explainability oftentimes in the proposals we mentioned earlier. But I have in the past year come to the thought that there's another term that we need to use increasingly. And the most recent ACM Tech paper on generative AI uses this term, and that is contestability. And the notion of contestability is that when an AI system makes an adverse determination about someone, turned down for a credit or a job or educational opportunity, we actually need a way to challenge that outcome. Not simply have the process that produced the outcome explained to us, you see? So in this concept of contestability is also the sense of fairness that many of the frameworks seek to establish. And as I said, I was very happy to see actually ACM incorporated this in addition to transparency and explainability in describing principles for the governance of generative AI.
I think it's a really difficult issue. There's a whole branch of research on explainable AI, and I can't help feeling that because of the way the systems are going bigger and bigger, the huge numbers of nodes and the sheer impossibility of anyone understanding how a decision's been made, that if we try and do research into explainable AI, will always be playing catch up to what the machines are doing, and we have to take the different approach. And I think it goes much more back to what we talked about earlier, which was openness, transparency, learning how to test, evaluate, and auditing. That sort of it goes back to that's the approach I think we should take, because it's very hard sometimes. You ask a human being how they made a decision, and you ask a doctor, and it's all about experience, and maybe whether they had a good cup of coffee in the morning. They might have had a different decision if they hadn't had a good cup of coffee in the morning. And we can't. I think we. So it is about the things we discussed earlier. I think a sort of the guidelines or whatever, they're guardrails, whatever we're calling them these days, and keeping. I hate to say this, the phrase "the human in the loop." I think we must always tackle these problems from a socio-technical approach, and not just what can the technology do. I do believe there is things the technology can do, like the watermarking, proving whether something, verifying. And I really, I might get shot for this in this audience. I really firmly believe that for safety, for people's safety, we're going to have to bring in digital IDs on a worldwide basis, so you can verify, and maybe for machines as well. I really do think that the only way for us to be safe is to have a way to verify who we are online, with the guardrails that the governments, just as they've done in India. Privacy is a human right. That's what the Supreme Court's done in India. Mark's smiling. I really believe we've got to address this dichotomy, and that if we've got to be able to verify people online, and maybe verify machines online in the same sort of way. But I think that's crucial, and I know I might get shot for saying it in this.
Wendy, I'm sorry. Can we agree that we should first verify machines before we verify people? At least make the priority correct?
No, I don't. I think for our safety, Mark, that's the trouble. I honestly think that, because if we don't, then I don't see how you manage the whole, people, us being, our identities being stolen. I just don't know how you manage it.
But you do know who's going to be doing the verification of the people.
No, I think we should have independent.
That's going to be done by the machines. That's the world you're describing. The machines verifying us.
Well, we have to have the like we're trying to set up regulation for AI, because the machines will do the auditing too, Mark. You know they will. That's what they'll be trained to do anything that's boring and repetitive. So it's all about making sure that the guardrails are there, so that whilst the machines might be doing the work, you've got independent authorities that actually regulate that space too.
Yeah.
So if I may
please.
Quickly, a couple of comments briefly. Transparency is something that is in the AI Act. So the transparency, there are transparency requirements. So the systems should operate in a way that is sufficiently transparent to the users, so that they can actually interpret the system's output, and then that they can also use it appropriately. And together with that goes hand in hand the kinds of instructions the user they need, so that they know how it should be used, and what it can be expected to do. Explainability, then, that's a hard nut to crack, and we actually are funding research projects in that area, because explainable AI obviously is very, very tough, and in that regard, we don't have specific provisions in the Act either, but there are also open research questions to the extent that I've understood the issues related to that.
Well, thank you. Since we're getting towards the end of our time, I would like to give you each in turn a couple of minutes for a closing statement, if that's okay with you. Who wants to go first?
Well, okay, I'll jump in, because I was just looking at, I haven't planned the closing statement, so I don't have a lot to say. I think I've said most of the things I want to cover. And it's been a great debate. Thank you, everybody, this is such a big and complicated issue. The more of these we can do, the better, to feed into our our governments. I want to say there have been some fabulous questions. I mean, Sandeep's been asking some lovely questions. The one about, if China comes to the table, how do you deal with cross-border liability and, the domination that China's going to have with autonomous vehicles? We've all got to struggle with this. Our governments have got to struggle with how we deal with this. These are really, really good questions that people have put up. So we haven't had time to delve in. You could have a whole webinar on some of these questions. I would like to say again how much I admire some of the work India's doing in this whole space. Not so much, they're not an AI power as such, but in terms of the digital infrastructure, they have done stuff that we can really look at in terms of how we manage our digital infrastructures in the democratic world. So I think that there are some fabulous ideas out there and I look forward to whatever we're going to build at a global level to discuss, the IPCC. I don't think that's the right model, the IPCC, but the organization that's going to take these discussions to a truly global level that's inclusive, and it's really hard to do that. And I'll finish by saying this right at the end. I've mentioned diversity. And someone asked, what do I mean by diversity? And it isn't just about gender diversity, although that is really important. It's really making sure, and I think we've demonstrated that here on this webinar, that it isn't just the people running the tech companies that have the say here, the deep technology gurus. I think it's about civil society, and it's about involving people, the lawyers, the philosophers, the people who run the companies, the government policymakers in this debate, as well as the people that are doing the amazing things with the technology.
Thank you, Wendy. Marc, Juha, who wants to go next?
Okay, well, just very briefly, a big thanks again to Adam and ACM for organizing this very timely discussion, and nice to see you, Michel, and Juha, and Wendy. I will repeat what I said at the outset, which is please don't ignore the governance frameworks that have already been established and the consensus that has already been reached in support of foundational principles for AI. I think in this moment, it's actually the biggest mistake and danger for those who are trying to make progress, that if we keep going back to the starting point, that's not going to succeed. We need to build on the prior work, and we need to continue to move forward. And I'm going to make a plea to Wendy and to the others who are participating in the upcoming UK AI Summit. It is so very important that the AI safety agenda not displace the AI fairness agenda.
Oh, I totally agree.
There has been so much focus, as you know, particularly by the UK government, on existential risk, which, we acknowledge as a concern. We talked about this 5 years ago and came up with a very good proposal called simply the termination obligation. If you can't manage a system, it's your responsibility to shut it down, full stop. I mean,
that's what the tech companies are not doing, right?
Well, this is my key point. We actually have a better answer to the existential risk problem than the people who are talking about existential risk. But our concern, and I'll wrap up, is that this has become all-consuming. As they say, it's taken the oxygen out of the room. And the ongoing concerns about algorithmic bias and fairness and transparency and accountability are literally being pushed to the fringe. That's how the satellite events are being described, as fringe events. This is a big mistake. The UK government has to get back on track, address the safety issue. It's a real concern. Don't make that the sole priority of the summit.
I totally agree with you, Marc. I'll be one voice there, but I couldn't agree with you more. Couldn't agree with you more.
Thank you, Wendy. Good luck. Godspeed.
Thank you.
So
thank you, Juha.
Yeah, so maybe, and Mark knows this very well, and Wendy equally. So we have not actually forgotten those other aspects. So the AI does actually, one of the sort of key risks we consider to be to safety and to fundamental rights, and that includes, you know, all those things that Mark mentioned. Let me just basically say something I wanted to say already throughout the session. I didn't get the opportunity. So I think, but this was Wendy actually sort of triggered it off, or didn't trigger off, but mentioned it already, is this changing landscape. And the fact that, you know, 2.5 years ago when we published our proposal, it was a lonely space. And now things have changed. I mean, not just in terms of the concern and, you know, kind of soft law governance approaches, but Canada has legislation in the pipeline. Brazil has plans, as far as I know. South Korea has a number of bills which are related to AI. And of course, in the US, whatever might come out, so the executive order, I think, is a given. The rest maybe less so, but also at the state and local level, we have things there which people don't necessarily always talk about and know. So, you know, things changed quite rapidly. They changed. So in a way, this I think ChatGPT is a bit like Cambridge Analytica was for data protection. That's kind of how I feel now, given that people all of a sudden started talking a lot about regulating AI, or at least having some kinds of guardrails. And in that sense, you know, we having started so much earlier, we feel that it's interesting to see this pick up. This just by way of an observation without any judgment in it, but still, you know, this sudden interest in all of this, it didn't start exactly a year ago. I mean, some countries and some organizations have been talking about this earlier, and of course, Canada had their proposal already before generative AI happened. But nevertheless, so, you know, we have these initiatives. There's a flurry of activity. You could even say that it's getting almost cacophonic, because there are so many organizations, so many people who want to jump on the bandwagon, want to have a say and want to be part of it for various reasons. But, you know, just the fact that people talk about AI governance, AI regulation in a completely different way from what it was 2.5 years ago, I think that's quite striking. That's quite interesting. And I think that it's good that we talk about them, talk about the issue now, and that these are topics that are not just pushed aside, and also the fact that companies themselves are talking about it. One can always question to what extent that's credible or not, but someone said that, you know, companies seem to be even afraid of each other. So that kind of pushes them to.
Of course they are.
So yeah. So that change, I think, has been quite remarkable. It's been quite interesting to observe. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Our time is up. Thank you to you three very much for agreeing to be on the panel. Thank you to Adam for organizing it. My final word will be that, you know, as Wendy pointed out, this is really very much a socio-technical issues. And so don't forget the humans, whether they're the ones making the systems or using them. 55 years ago, Douglas Engelbart created a system called NLS, whose goal was to augment human intellect. I think we have the technology today to really augment human intellect. And I personally, because I'm an HCI person, hope that, you know, this system won't replace us, but will make us better at what we do as humans. So with that, I leave you with a slide that Adam has put up here with the Technology Policy Council contacts. If you're interested in joining our activities, please contact us. And of course, please go to the website to find about our activities. So thank you, everyone, and have a good end of the day or evening or morning or wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Michel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll clap for the rest of the audience.